Welcome to Burgonomics, demystifying economics with Ross McDowell.
Welcome to the Burgonomics podcast, where my experts and I demystify current topics through the paradigm of economics. I'm your host, Ross McDowell. Australia has seen an amazing boom in house prices. The price of your home affects your emotional state. Its price goes up, you feel good. In fact, so good, you may buy a new car or take a holiday. If all 9.1 million households feel good at the same time, and everyone decides to buy cars and have holidays, that can create inflation. And that's what's happening now. Joining me today to discuss these issues is Dr. Brendan Rinn. Dr. Rinn is KPMG's Chief Economist for Australia. Dr. Rinn is an adjunct professor in the School of Economics and Finance at London's Queen Mary University and is an advisory board member of the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research at the University of Melbourne. Brendan, welcome to the Burgonomics podcast.
Thanks, Ross. Thanks for having me.
There are 9.1 million households in Australia. Those homes have a combined value of more than $9.98 trillion. Residential property prices, until recently, have been skyrocketing. That's made a lot of Australians feel very wealthy over a long period of time. They didn't have to work any harder for that increased wealth. They didn't have to risk anything for that increased wealth. All they had to do was wake up every morning and they were richer. In economics, there's a concept called the wealth effect, and that describes what occurs when you wake up every morning wealthier. Can you just explain what the wealth effect is for us?
So simply the wealth effect is really a concept relating to consumption and spending. And as you pointed out, how households feel each day about their economic prosperity has a direct influence on their spending patterns. And so largely most households, particularly in Australia, their wealth lies in their home, their residential property. And so if their house is going up in value, they feel positive about life and they have a predisposition to spending more. When their house prices start to fall, they start to get concerned about the economic outlook, about their dwindling wealth, and they start to rein in their spending. So there's a direct linkage between consumption patterns and asset values.
Right. So I found that some research was done in 2010 in the US by some academics called Carroll and Zhao, and they found that for every additional $100,000 increase in value of a person's home, he would spend an additional $6,000 per year in terms of his personal spending year on year. So if we look at Australia's housing stock rose by $1.1 trillion up until last June, before we started going through some declines, that would mean an increase in spending in Australia by people's homes that have gone up by $66 billion, which is a massive amount of money if that US research is applicable to Australia. Now, the result of that spending's going to contribute to inflation, isn't it?
That's correct. And thinking about what we see in the data about monthly retail spending, that seems to hold true. So if you have a look for the period prior to COVID, we were generally spending around $29 billion a month in retail sales each month. We then went through COVID, where you had a whole lot of volatility that didn't really have too much of an impact on or being driven by wealth. It was more so being driven around your capacity to spend. there was also a whole lot of economic uncertainty rolled up in there. We also did go through a period of asset price declines at the beginning when people were a bit unsure about what was happening. But once we've sort of started to get a bit of clear air after COVID, what we've seen is that monthly retail sales now, they're trending up, and they're about $33, $34 billion a month on a sustained basis. So there's been this step change up. It's probably likely one of the influences of that step change has been this wealth effect, where people have seen that their house prices have gone up by 40%. From pre-COVID to the peak in about March, May of this year. And that's been driving their propensity to spend. Some of this consumption has also been catch-up spending. Some people call it revenge spending, that they were looking to, basically put big dents in their wallet after not being able to. But nonetheless, there has been this noticeable step change in monthly retail sales. The question's going to be whether that's going to be sustainable in the near future.
Okay, so that consumption, which is another way of saying it's people competing for goods and services, and as people compete for the goods and services, the prices of them go up.
Yes.
So we've got an inflation situation in Australia now where there's two facets to it. There's what we've just discussed, which is the wealth effect, and there's also things maybe outside of our control, such as wars going on with commodities, etc. But the Reserve Bank wants to keep inflation down, and they've got a sort of a band of around about 3% or thereabouts. And then people are saying inflation may go up to as much as 8% depending upon who you want to listen to. So as a result of the wealth effect, what does the Reserve Bank do?
So, look, that's a really good question, but I think we probably need to understand how we got to this level of inflation that we've got to. So really, if you think about the beginning of the year, the Reserve Bank was anticipating annual inflation of only 2.5% at this point in time, where we are now. But what happened was that we went through this period where there was just a confluence of events that really started to drive prices up. So firstly, you had global supply chains being negatively impacted by COVID. Through a number of different mechanisms. Firstly, there were shutdowns globally, so just production capacity around the globe reduced from where it used to be. You then also had the ability to transport the goods from where they're produced to where they're consumed being influenced by just the normal operations of transport channels because, they were shut down because of COVID. But then the cost of transporting that in itself started to rise dramatically. So you had not only a limitation in the supply of goods available for sale, you then had an increase in the cost of transport to bring those goods to market. So globally, that's really where things started to kick off. That you then also had this mechanism where governments and also central banks around the world had highly accommodative fiscal and monetary policy settings. They basically pumped cash into the economy to give people the capacity to spend and basically keep the wheels turning. But they did too much. They all know now they did too much. So what that did was lifted aggregate demand because everyone had all this money in their pockets, at the same point that you had a fall in aggregate supply. So you're then getting, this price pressure going up. Then the third element on top of that was you had the Russia-Ukraine war, which then added more disruption, particularly in commodity markets. And for most parts of the world, that was pretty negative. But for Australia, who's a large commodity producer, with the exception of the oil imports we bring in, we actually got a terms of trade kicker out of it. We've had a positive effect associated with it. Higher coal prices, higher grain prices. Yes, we've paid more for oil, but so's the rest of the world. So what that's done is that's lifted input costs, particularly oil, for example. And what we do know is that transport costs, which are being predominantly driven by oil prices and oil, is when you break the Australian economy up into 114 different sectors, which they do for the input-output tables, transport cost is the only sector of the 114 that touches every other sector.
Right.
So you're getting these
Flow-on effects.
Flow-on effects through higher transport costs. So all of that is building up, and we're now, starting to see inflation take off. Australia was a little bit behind the rest of the world in this. But what we're only starting to see now is wages starting to grow because of inflation, this catch-up. And what the Reserve Bank will be mostly worried about is whether you get into a wage price spiral. And what that will be doing is that's why they're driving interest rates up. They're trying to bring aggregate demand down, and they're trying to get inflation down as quickly as possible before it gets into our psyche that inflation is now embedded, and therefore we need to ask for higher wages to cover our inflation costs that are because we're getting these real spending or purchasing power declines. And so that's absolutely going to be what's driving the Reserve Bank, or is driving the Reserve Bank at the moment. Is sure, there's temporary inflationary pressures that I've described through various supply and demand factors, but fundamentally the biggest concern in Australia is if we start to get wages growth that gets built into inflationary expectations.
Because we've been down that path before, haven't we, in the 70s and the 90s in terms of...
And it's much harder to reverse. You've got to remember that wages, they last, when you ask for a price increase in your wage or a wage increase, they tend to last 12 months.
Yeah.
So whereas some of these commodity prices and oil prices, they fluctuate day-to-day basis. So you can see a spike and then that spike fall away.
Right.
So they don't become so embedded. Wages are much more embedded.
Stickier.
Yeah.
So the Reserve Bank increases its interest rates. Well, it does other things. It reduces the amount of money in the system by reversing its quantitative easing programs, etc. But what people, I guess, at the moment see that affects them is the increase in interest rates.
Yes.
And that one of the effects of that is that it causes a reversal of the wealth effect.
Correct.
To some degree, doesn't it? So one of the first things that happens is that in a predictive way, house prices start to decline.
Yep.
Because the borrowing capacity of people is reduced because of those increased interest rates. We've got, 15% decline in house prices recently? Something like that?
Yeah, I think my understanding is that we've seen about a 10% decline, but if you annualise the most recent quarterly decline, it's about 15. So if the pace of decline in the last quarter kept going for 12 months, it'd be 15. But what we've seen in terms of from peak to where we are, it's about 10.
Where do you think it could go in terms of declines in house prices?
Yeah, that's the $64 million question. I think we've still got some way to go. I think our expectation is that house prices will probably bottom out in the second quarter of next year. The reason for that is that it takes a bit of time for these higher interest rates to feed their way through the economy, for people to change their spending patterns, and ultimately what is going to precipitate much larger falls is when households find themselves in the position where they're forced to sell. The question's going to be is to how much of how much of current mortgage holders are going to find themselves in the position that they're going to be unable to service their mortgage at these higher rates. And
do you think that will happen? Do you think that we will, because it's happened before in Australia, do you think we will get to a stage where people will go, I can't afford my mortgage and I'm going to have to sell?
Yes, I do. I think but it's not going to be as universal. So where I think the biggest risk is going to be those people that have purchased most recently and taken out extraordinarily large mortgages based on repayments that were unsustainably low, very low interest rates. But I can say that most banks, particularly after the GFC, have adopted, very careful prudential lending, and they really have operated in a way where they don't want their customers to get into that position. That's not saying that no one's going to get there. I suspect there will be.
There will be. If I'm a home owner and I'm listening to this conversation you are having now, while I might not be in that position at the moment, just thinking about that position will make a lot of people feel queasy.
Correct, absolutely. And this is going back to your first question about the wealth effect. So what you start to see happen is people, pull in their purse strings.
The spending.
And the first stuff that goes is the discretionary spending. You just haven't seen that so much yet.
Okay, let's get to that. There's another interesting piece of research that I've found. 40 years ago, a psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, if I've pronounced that correctly, he measured human emotions when asset prices rose, and he found that on his measurements, when asset prices rose, they only felt half as good as when the same negative effect when they declined. In other words, let's say you had 10 units of happiness when your house price went up. Well, you're going to have 20 units of unhappiness when it goes down. And it's sort of
so there's an unhappiness bias to see when
toward it
to wealth.
If we look at, we're talking about then interest rates going up, and therefore disposable income goes backwards. We've got in Australia $2 trillion worth of home mortgages at the moment. In the last 12 months, mortgage interest rates have increased by 3.5%, which is the fastest pace in the last 30 years. That 3.5% increase on that $2 trillion worth of mortgages amounts to $70 billion less money for people to do with what they want, either to save or to spend. So that at the moment, there must be a whole lot of very anxious people out there because of what's going on.
No, that's right. There's a couple of things to recognise, though, that in the run-up to COVID, most people, actually it's prior to about 2018, because what you started to see in about 2019, even before COVID, was that long-term bond yields started to decline. So the cost of fixed-rate mortgages in 2019 started to fall relative to variable mortgage rates. In Australia, there's a propensity for most borrowers to have variable mortgage interest rates, which is very different to the US. They lock in for long fixed rate terms. But when the market started to have a discount, in effect, to longer term fixed rate mortgages, we moved from around 15% of mortgages being written as fixed rate mortgages through to COVID. The peak in COVID in any 1 month was 45%. So what we've actually got is, although it's starting to roll off now, is a much higher proportion of Australian mortgage owners with fixed rate contracts, fixed rate mortgages at very low rates compared to what they are at the moment, who are progressively going to roll off into much higher mortgage rates.
This is the cliff people talk about.
Yeah, but it's not a cliff, it's a mound.
Right.
So it's not a fiscal cliff in a sense that you've got, 100% of fixed rate mortgages finishing in March of next year. They're progressively rolling off. And so that's also one of the reasons why you haven't seen much of a decline in retail sales, is that you're getting this transition occurring from low rate fixed term mortgages that are rolling off to higher rate variable mortgages. So that in itself helps the economy, because what you're not getting is a single shock.
It's gradual.
Yeah, so you're getting this gradual effect running through. But the numbers that you spoke about is absolutely right. What you're getting is a transfer of disposable income available to spend on goods and services into disposable income that now needs to be spent on higher mortgage costs.
But there's one problem. That doesn't seem to be happening.
Not at the moment.
And that's the great quandary, isn't it? We've got consumer confidence at rock bottom.
Yep.
But the spending from those consumers that have got no confidence is exactly the same. It hasn't really changed.
Yep.
Why hasn't it changed?
So one of the things that we've been talking about is all about in aggregate, and spending in aggregate. One of the things we haven't mentioned is the fact that there are more Australians working than has ever been the case before. So we have an unemployment rate in Australia at about 3.5%. That's more than full employment. And what that generates is the most amount of available disposable income to be spent in the country than's ever been the case. So when you start to look at the quantum of money that's available to basically get sloshed around and spent on goods and services, it's huge. And so that momentum of people being employed, and therefore people having more money in their pocket to spend than if they were either unemployed or on welfare, has been pushing the Australian consumption side of the economy along at a pace that doesn't necessarily make sense when you think about it in the isolation of higher interest rates. The other thing to also remember is that roughly the Australian housing market is about a third. A third of Australians own a home and have a mortgage. A third of Australians own a home and don't have a mortgage. And a third of Australians rent a home from someone.
A landlord.
Either a private or public landlord.
Yeah.
So if you think about monetary policy and its transmission effects, really it's coming through directly on the consumption side through initially households with mortgages. It's the wealth effect really hits people from households with no mortgages. In fact, you get a bit of reverse, because it's often those people without a mortgage that own their home where higher interest rates give them high disposable income because they've got savings. Sure. And they can spend more. And then renters, their rent gets adjusted gradually over time because they're locked in for rental periods.
Leases, yeah.
And mortgage and their investor owners will adjust as their interest rate comes up. So from a whole of economy perspective, higher mortgage rates in the first instance only hit a third of households. They also hit the business sector in terms of the businesses' propensity to invest, but remember that investment's only about 20% of GDP.
So we're getting the effect that the Reserve Bank wants to have to cool inflation isn't immediate at all. We've got lots of savings, $552 billion in Australian savings accounts.
Yeah.
We've got household saving ratio decreasing, so people are spending this and not saving as much.
No, but they're still saving.
But they're
so
still,
the savings ratio is positive, it's not negative.
So
yeah.
And you've brought up this question of we're at full employment.
Yeah.
We're at really full employment, aren't we? I mean, if you look at...
We're tight as a drum.
I mean, has Australia ever had 3.5% unemployment before?
Yeah, we have, but it's back into the 1970s, which was a completely different structure in our economy. But, I think 3.5% unemployment where we're at the moment is artificial. It's artificial because of the disruption to, our labour market that occurred due to COVID and the shutting of our borders.
So you expect it to change?
Yeah, we expect unemployment rate to trend back up over the next 12 months to be about 4.5%.
Which is still
fantastic.
Historically.
Yeah, fantastic.
Full employment.
It's still full employment. That is our definition. What we think full employment is
4%.
Yeah, NAIRU, 4%. So for the listeners, NAIRU is non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment.
That's applied economics.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think we've got a generation of people, based upon age, out there that aren't in touch with the 1970s, that aren't in touch with unemployment rates, have no fear themselves they believe of losing their job, and because they don't have that fear, they think, well, why should I stop spending?
To some degree, yes. But, in thinking about this, the alternative being having a population that's had a lived experience of their economy going in and out of economic downturns, just so that they can have the experience of going in and out of economic downturns. I'd much rather be someone who's lived in Australia over the last 30 years, who's technically only had one recession, and be a little bit naive, because we know that our quality of life and our living standard has been benefited so much by that positive run of economic outcomes.
Of 24 recessionless years, and even then the recession.
Yeah. So, look, I think that is the case, but it's the whole thing about adjustments in behaviour. People will work that out, and they'll either work it out in time or they won't, but they'll work it out because it'll get forced on them.
Do you think also that they've been through the COVID situation and the quantitative easing situation, which is basically we've got a bad social or a bad economic problem and the government has ridden in, or the Reserve Bank has ridden into the rescue? So, post-2008, the Great Recession, right, we're going to do, well, what my generation would be, has horror about, print money.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, that saves the day. COVID, no one can go to work. We start giving them money.
Yeah.
It saves the day.
Yeah.
Do you think we've got a generation of people that think that someone's always there to save the day?
So you're describing the Greenspan put in a social context. I don't think that people explicitly recognise that. I think that they see major events and they see government's role as to come and support them, but I don't necessarily think that there's such an explicit play per se that they can, that the government's going to come in as the white knight and save them, and therefore they can just play merry for as long as they want. But I do also think that you're now starting to see noises not only from the Australian government, but many governments around the world arguing that at least in the short term they can't do that anymore. And the reason being is that there's a tacit understanding, recognition that the inflation problem that the world is facing today is in part because of these highly accommodative fiscal and monetary policies that pumped cash into everyone's pockets. And I think that the new Treasurer Chalmers and the budget that he's just laid down is a good example of that, where it's very clear that there are pockets in Australian society that are doing it tough now and will only do it tougher as interest rates rise and cost of living continues to put pressure on them. And it would have been a really easy political fix to keep dishing out money to those constituents, particularly in the probably low socio-economic households who I think the Labor Party would consider them to be their traditional voter base. But they didn't give them that cash, and the reason why they didn't give them that cash was the Treasurers acknowledged that pumping cash in the economy at the moment is only going to be inflationary, and you cannot have monetary policy on the brake and fiscal policy on the accelerator at the same time.
But having said that, he still did run a deficit.
We're going to be running deficits for a very long time.
But we could be running a surplus with our fantastic terms of trade.
No, we couldn't. Not at the moment. We've got too much structural issues within the economy. We're not going to run a surplus, I think, for the foreseeable future, and we're not going to run a surplus until we do a wholesale resetting of not only our incomes side of federal budget, but also our expenditure side as well.
Okay, probably a different discussion. So we're in a situation where we've got the wealth effectors assisted with the inflation, not being the sole creator. The Reserve Bank wants to reverse and just cool everything down, and they're going to do that by increasing interest rates. But it's not happening quick enough, per se, because our spending's still up. There's this fantastic analogy of the elastic band and the brick, which is just, I think, great. So if we think about what a brick represents is Australians out there spending money, and the elastic band is the interest rates, and the Reserve Bank's got their finger on the elastic band, and they figure you increased interest rates, and that means that the finger's pulling that elastic band, and then what they'd like to see is that brick just creep a little bit forward, meaning a reduction in spending.
Yes.
And so we can move the brick wherever we want to move it just by moving gradually the elastic band, but that's not happening. What we're doing is we're pulling that elastic band, it's getting tighter and tighter, the brick's not moving. There's social comment about, look at the pain that we must be going through, but the effect that the elastic band should be having, which is a reduction in spending, isn't happening. There's nothing else to do but to keep on jacking up interest rates. And so many times before in so many countries we've seen the result. All of a sudden the brick starts to move, but it moves so quickly it can't stop. And the brick goes crashing into the hand, and it's pretty painful. Do you think that's what could happen here?
Absolutely. And what that analogy is the fact that monetary policy works with a lag. And what we're seeing is that lag effect getting built up in the potential energy that's getting stored in the elastic band. And so effectively what happens is that the public, because of what I've said to you before about the different transmission mechanisms, is that you'll move by 25 basis points or 50 basis points and you won't get much of a movement. because it
So, but basis points for those that don't know.
is so 25 basis points is 1/4% interest rate change.
Yep.
Yeah, 1 basis point is 0.1 of an interest rate change.
Okay.
So, yeah, sorry for being an economist. But what happens is, you're only getting a small proportion of the population that movement in the interest rate has a direct effect to. But gradually, as people become more exposed to those interest rate movements, as their psyche starts to pick up the fact that they're getting into tighter economic conditions and that they're seeing this come through, most likely indirectly through different parts of the economy, not necessarily through the interest rates. And then all of a sudden, there's a recognition within the community that that the economy is slowing, and that the reserve and that the cost of doing things is much higher than it was. And then there's an immediate change in spending patterns and behaviour. In effect, that brick has come at you. It's held back, and then all of a sudden there's this collective response within the economy where all the previous changes that have been put through in monetary policy tightening and even fiscal policy tightening come at you all at once.
When do you reckon that's going to happen?
So they usually say the lag for monetary policy is between 6 to 12 months. We've now had 7 consecutive increases in interest rates. Arguably, we're just into contractionary monetary policy territory now. And what I mean by that is that what's considered the neutral rate, the Goldilocks rate for interest rates, neither too hot nor too cold, it's just right, is about 2.5%. So we're now at 2.85%. So we've flipped into the slightly, hot interest rate, too hot for people to start using. And we still think that there's another 0.5% movement, 50 basis point movement to come with increases in the central bank, in the Reserve Bank. So I think there's another 25 in December and probably another 25 in February or March.
You don't think it's going to go to 4% like some people say?
No, I don't think so. And the reason why I say that is because of these lag effects. And also the other thing is that what we've got in society is a much more sensitive community, a much more sensitive household sector to interest rate movements than we've ever had in the past. And that's got to do with the amount of debt that we're carrying. So when you look over time, that you have to remember that monetary policy is not just interest rate, it's actually interest payments. And so interest payments are a function of 2 components. 1, the interest rate, but 2, the debt level in which we're paying that interest on. And we're at the highest level of household debt ever. So it's about 190% of household income, disposable household income. And when you have a look at those 2 factors, it was in the late 1990s that you saw that interest payments, the predominant factor driving interest payments, switch from being the interest rate to the debt level. And so what's happened is that the sensitivity in interest payments now is much more focused on interest rates, because debt levels are much more fixed and they're higher and you can't move those. So you only need to have smaller movements in the interest rate to get the desired effect on interest payments that are going to be pulled out of the economy.
Okay. And it's taking a while to get there.
Correct.
When do you think we're going to get that euphoric feeling of the positive part of the wealth effect again in Australia?
Wow. So I think that the Australian economy is already starting to slow now. But if you think that we're basically at a peak, and we will start to slide down that peak, I think the rest of the year will be okay. I think the first 6 months of next year will be slowing, and then I think the next 6 months, so the back end of 2023 will be pretty flat, and probably the first 6 months of 2024 will be in the same vein. So I don't think that we'll start to have that sense of a positive momentum in the economy probably until the end of 2024.
Right.
So, but that's not unusual. There's a thing to also remind the punters that of a concept called the business cycle.
Which they've forgotten about because they've just only had one business cycle for 24 years.
Yeah. So there's an up, there's a peak, there's a down, there's a bottom, and then there's an up again. And so in all of those, they all take a bit of time. They're not instantaneous. And so I think the oscillation that we're going to have is a little bit of a drawn-out bottom. Question's going to be whether that bottom goes below zero, as in we're getting negative growth and everything's tightening right up.
And do you mean a recession by saying that?
Yeah, I still don't believe we're going to go into recession, based on facts today.
Yeah.
I don't think that we'll be in recession. I think that we're going to be in a very slow economy.
Okay. To conclude our podcast, I ask all my experts to take the ergonomics test.
Yeah.
Where you've got to...
How many burgers you can eat in a minute?
Something like that. I think that could be a good challenge.
Yeah.
You've got to encapsulate what we've talked about today, the wealth effect, the housing, the business cycle, the interest rates. You've got to try and pop that all into how's this going to affect the simple hamburger now and as we go through what we're about to go through with the interest rate increases. You can choose any different way you want to encapsulate it.
So first and foremost, I can say that I've never been a market economist for the hamburger segment. And so I've got no background in being able to forecast this. And I'm not very clever, so I've got to really break this down into fundamentals. So if I look at this from a supply side, what we've seen is grain markets disrupted with Russia-Ukraine conflict. So bun costs have to be higher today than they were at the start of the year. And as I understand it, that grain market's starting to normalise, so I don't expect prices to fall, but they'll probably stay elevated. So we've got supply side pressures there. The lettuce, tomato and meat prices, I think, have risen pretty sharply due to the flooding events that we've had. And they've also had some upward pressure due to labour shortages and transport cost increases. So again, on the supply side, we're seeing a pressure for price increases. From the demand side, we've got more people working, like I said, 3.5% unemployment rate. So we've got more disposable income in aggregate. So the demand for people wanting to buy burgers, because more people are working, is probably elevated. I still think that we've got a overhang of being locked up for COVID. and people wanting to do more things outside of the house. So services demand is normalising, coming off a lower base. So buying burgers outside of home, I think, is still pretty high. Demand's pretty high. And I think you're also getting some people feeling the higher interest costs already on their household budgets, and they're probably looking to switch from higher food cost to lower food cost. And hamburgers are a relatively lower food cost item, so I expect their demand to rise as a substitutable product. So overall, I think demand is continuing to rise for hamburgers, despite some supply-side pressures.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all good, as far as I can see, for the burger market, as far as the eye can see.
So we can all relax that hamburgers aren't going to hopefully skyrocket in prices, and we'll all be enjoying them for the next foreseeable future.
Oh, I think burger prices are obviously rising, but I still think there's probably enough market forces to keep it under control. But nonetheless, the demand for a good hamburger is clearly remaining rock solid.
Brendan, thank you for joining me today, because I believe that lots and lots of people out there are concerned about their value of their home, what that's doing to their spending, where interest rates are going, and to have someone with your experience explain it to them in simple terms, I think is very reassuring. And thank you also for that fantastic analysis of the hamburger market. Good on you.
Oh, my pleasure, and I appreciate being asked to talk to you today. Thanks very much.
My thanks to today's expert guest, Dr. Brendan Rinn, KPMG's Chief Economist. This is my takeout from today's podcast with Dr. Rinn. The wealth effect is when we feel secure in our spending patterns based on the rising value of our homes. Until recently, those home values had skyrocketed. We felt wealthier and spent more on goods and services. That increased inflation. The Reserve Bank needed us to reduce our spending to reduce inflation. They increased interest rates. Bigger mortgage payments and dropping home values, causing a reverse wealth effect, should have caused our spending to decline. But so far, it hasn't. That's because unemployment is practically non-existent, and there is little chance we will be without a job to pay the mortgage. It's only when there's a whiff of unemployment will our psychology change. A bit of fear creeps into our minds, added to the bigger mortgage payments, and our home, which is now dropped in value, and then we'll start to reduce our spending. And that'll cause inflation to decrease, and we won't need the interest rate rises anymore. Dr. Rinn believes these factors will start occurring during 2023. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Burgonomics podcast on Apple and Spotify, and pass it on to others who you might think will enjoy the demystification of economics. Jump onto Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram and TikTok and give us your opinion. I'm Ross McDowell. Thanks for listening.